Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 2. Mr. Shepherd, a civil, cautious lawyer, who, whatever might be his hold or his views on Sir Walter, would rather have a disagreeable prompt by anyone else, excused himself from offering even the slightest hint, and only begged to leave to recommend an implicit reference to the excellent judgment of Lady Russell, whose known good sense he fully expected to have such resolute measures advised as he meant to see finally adopted. Lady Russell was most anxiously zealous on the subject, and gave it much serious consideration. She was a woman rather of sound than of quick abilities, whose difficulties in coming to any decision in this instant were great. From the opposition of two leading principles, she was of strict integrity herself, with a delicate sense of honour, but she was desirous of saving Sir Walter's feelings, as solicitous of the credit of the family, as autocratic in her ideas of what was due to them, as anybody of sense and honesty could well be. She was benevolent, charitable, a good woman, and capable of strong attachments, most correct in her conduct, strict in her notions of decorum, and with manners that were held a standard of good breeding. She had a cultivated mind, and was, generally speaking, rational and consistent, but she had prejudices on the side of the ancestry. She had a value for rank and consequence which blinded her a little to the faults of those who possessed them. Herself the widow of only a knight, she gave the dignity of a baronet all its due, and Sir Walter, independent of his claims as an old acquaintance, an attentive neighbour, an obliging landlord, the husband of her very dear friend, the father of Anne and her sisters, was, as being Sir Walter in her apprehension, entitled a great deal of compassion and consideration under his present difficulties. They must retrench, that did not admit a doubt. She was very anxious to have it done with the least possible pain to him and Elizabeth. She drew up plans of economy, she made exact calculations, and she did what nobody else thought of doing. She consulted Anne, who never seemed considerate by the others of having any interest in the question. She consulted, and in a degree was influenced by her in the marking out the scheme of retrenchment, which was at last submitted to Sir Walter. Every admonition of Anne's had been on the side of honesty against importance. She wanted more vigorous measures, a more complete reformation, a quicker release of debt, and a higher tone of indifference for everything but justice and equity. "If we can persuade your father to all this," said Lady Russell, looking over their paper, "much may be done. If he will adopt these regulations, in several years he will become clear, and I hope that we may be able to convince him and Elizabeth that Kellynch Hall was a respectability itself could not be affected by these reductions, and that the true dignity of Sir Walter Elliot will be very far from lessened in the eyes of sensible people. By acting like a man of principle, what will he be doing, in fact, but what very many of our first families have done, or ought to do? There would be nothing singular in his case, and it is singularity which often makes the worst part of our suffering, as it always does in our conduct. I have great hope of prevailing, and we must be serious and decided. For, after all, the person who has contracted debt must pay them, and through a great deal is due to the feelings of the gentleman, and the head of the house, like your father, there is still more due to the character of an honest man." This was a principle on which Anne wanted her father to be proceeding. His friends to be urging him, she considered it as an act of indispensable duty to clear away the claims of creditors with all the expedition which the most comprehensive retrenchments could secure, and saw no dignity in anything short of it, and wanted it to be prescribed. As felt as duty, she rated Lady Russell's influence highly. As to the severe degree of self-denial which her own conscience prompted, she believed there might be little more difficulty in persuading them to a complete than to half of the reformation. Her knowledge of her father and Elizabeth inclined her to think that the sacrifice on one pair of the horses would be hardly less painful than both, and so on, through the whole list of Lady Russell's too gentle reductions. How Anne's more rigid requisitions might have taken is little of consequence. Lady Russell had no success at all, and could not be put up with, were not to be borne. What! Every comfort of life knocked off, journeys, Londons, servants, horses, table, contradictions and restrictions everywhere, to live no longer with decencies even of a private gentleman. No, he would sooner quit Kellynch Hall at once, than remain in such graceful terms. Quit Kellynch Hall! The was immediately taken up by Mr. Shepherd, whose interest was followed in the reality of Sir Walter's retrenching, who had perfectly persuaded that nothing would be done without a change of abode. Since the idea had been started in a very quarter which ought to dictate, he had no scruple. He said, in confessing his judgment to entirely on that side, it did not appear to him that Sir Walter could materially alter his style in a living house which had such a character of hospitality, and the ancient dignity to support in any other place. Sir Walter might judge for himself, and would be looked up to, as regulating the modes of life in whatever way he might choose to model his household. Sir Walter would quit Kellynch Hall, and after a very few days of more doubt and indecision, and the great question of whither he should go was settled, and the first outline of this important change made out. There was three alternatives: London, Bath, or another house in the country. All Anne's wishes had been for the latter, and a small house in their own neighbourhood, which might have still had Lady Russell's society, might be near Mary, and still have the pleasure of sometimes seeing the lawns and groves of Kellynch, was the object of her ambition. But the usual fate of Anne attended her, and having something very opposite from her inclination fixed on. She disliked Bath, and did not think it agreed with her, and Bath was to be her home. Sir Walter at first had thought more of London, but Mr. Shepherd felt that he could not be trusted in London, and was skilful enough to dissuade him from it, with Bath preferred. It was a much safer place for a gentleman of his predicament. He might be more important at a comparative little expense. Two material advantages of Bath over London had of course given all their weight. In convenient distance from Kellynch, only 50 miles, and Lady Russell's spending of some part of every winter there, and to be the great satisfaction of Lady Russell, whose first views on the projected change for Bath, Sir Walter and Elizabeth were induced to believe that they should lose neither consequence nor enjoyment by settling there. Lady Russell felt obliged to oppose to dear Anne's known wishes. It would be too much to expect Sir Walter to descend in a small house in his own neighbourhood. Anne herself would have found mortifications of it that she foresaw, and to Sir Walter's feelings they might have been dreadful, and with the first regard to Anne's dislike of Bath, she considered it as a prejudice and mistake arising from the first circumstance of having her been 3 years at school there after her mother's death, and secondly, from her happening not to be in perfectly good spirits for only winter which she had afterwards spent there with herself. Lady Russell was fond of Bath, in short, and disposed to think that it might suit them all, as to her young friend's health, by passing all the warm months with her at the College Lodge, every danger would be avoided, and it was in fact a change to which must do both health and spirits good. Anne had too little from home, too little seen, her spirits were not high, and a larger society might improve them. She wanted her to be more known. The undesirableness of any other house in the same neighbourhood for Sir Walter was certainly much strengthened by one part, and very material of the part of the scheme, which she had been happily engrafted by on the beginning. She would not only quit his home, but only to see it as the hands of others, a trial of fortitude, which stronger heads than Sir Walter have found too much. Kellynch Hall was to be let. This, however, was a profound secret, and could not be breathed beyond their own circle. Sir Walter could not have borne the degradation of being known to design letting his house. Mr. Shepherd had once mentioned the word advertised, but never dared to approach it again. Sir Walter spurned the idea of being offered in any manner, forbade the slightest hint being dropped of his having such intention. It was only on the supposition of being spontaneously solicited by some of the most unacceptable applicant on his own terms, and at a great favour, that he would let it all. How quickly come the reasons for approving what he liked! Lady Russell had another excellent one hand for extremely glad that Sir Walter and his family were to remove from the country. Elizabeth had been lately forming an intimacy which she wished to see interrupted. It was with the daughter of Mr. Shepherd, who returned after an unprosperous marriage to her father's house. An additional burthen of 2 children. She was a clever woman, and who understood the art of pleasing at least in Kellynch Hall, who had made herself so acceptable to Miss Elliot as to already stay there for more than once. In spite of all that, Lady Russell, who thought it a friendship quite out of place, could hint caution and reserve. Lady Russell indeed had scholarly influence with Elizabeth, but seemed to love her, rather because she would love her, than Elizabeth deserved it. She never received from her more than outward attention, nothing beyond observance of complaisance, and never succeeded in any point which she wanted to carry between previous inclination. She had repeatedly earnest in trying to get Anne included to the visit of London, sensibly opened all to the injustice and discredit for selfish arrangements, and shut her out, and on the many lesser occasions she had endeavoured to give Elizabeth the advantage of her own better judgment and experience. But always in vain. Elizabeth would go in her own way, and she had never pursued it in more decided opposition to Lady Russell than this of a selection of Mrs. Clay, turning on one society so deserving a sister to bestow her affection and confidence on one who had have been nothing to her than an object of distant civility. From situation, Miss Clay was, in Lady Russell's estimate, a very unequal, and in her character she believed a very dangerous companion, in the removal that would leave Mrs. Clay behind, and bring a choice of more suitable intimates with Miss Elliot's reach, and therefore an object of first-rate importance.